This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. Hello, friends. I'm so glad you're here. I've got a very special episode for you today. I was a guest at the John Fox Jr. Literary Festival at Mountain Empire Community College. My good friend Amy Greer, who coordinates that festival, invited me to come and be in conversation with Silas House and Beth Macy. So we were in front of a live audience, and we just had the best time. This is the third time I've had Silas on the podcast, and the first time I've had Beth Macy on the podcast. And so we had a conversation about writing, growth in writing, what it takes to write about Appalachia and people who are close to you, even sometimes when it's not flattering. We just covered a lot of areas. So let me introduce the two of them, and then we'll get right into the conversation. Beth Macy is a Virginia-based journalist who writes about outsiders and underdogs. She's the award-winning author of 3 New York Times bestselling books examining communities left behind by corporate greed and political indifference. Her first book, Factory Man, explored the aftermath of globalization on rural communities and won a J. Anthony Lucas Prize. And you're probably familiar with Dopesick, her investigation of the opioid crisis, which was shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal. It won the LA Times Book Prize for Science and Technology, and it was described as a, quote, masterwork of narrative nonfiction, end quote, by the New York Times. And Dopesick was made into a Peabody and Emmy award-winning Hulu series on which Macy served as an executive producer and co-writer. Her most recent book is Paper Girl, a memoir of home and family. I just finished it. It's very good. In a Fractured America. And it's a combination memoir and a reported analysis of the rural-urban divide told through the lenses of backward mobility, political polarization, and the decimation of local news. Silas House is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of novels Clay's Quilt, A Parchment of Leaves, The Cold Tattoo, Eli the Good, Same Sun Here, Southernmost, and Lark Ascending, as well as a creative nonfiction book titled Something's Rising, co-authored with Jason Howard, 4 plays, a book of poetry, All These Ghosts, and his first murder mystery, Dead Man Blues. He was also Poet Laureate of Kentucky. And All These Ghosts recently won the Southern Book Prize. So really happy for Silas and his success with his first book of poetry. So here is my conversation with Beth Macy and Silas House. Both of you are several books into your career now. How do you think your work as writers has evolved with age and experience?
All of my books, all 5, have grown out of, well, except for the last one, have grown out of reporting I originally had done for the Roanoke Times. When I came to the Roanoke Times in 1989, it had 65 reporters. Now it has 4. So I'm just so grateful for that experience, being able to embed in my community. You know, I only write nonfiction. I tried to write fiction in grad school. I was terrible at it. So I salute you. I prefer to read fiction myself, but I always wanted to tell the stories of outsiders and underdogs. And about 10 years into my career as a newspaper reporter, I just pitched those stories because those were the stories I found were the most important. And I told them the best. My favorite story I ever wrote, bar none, out of thousands of stories, is the story of a young woman I met. She was a page at the library, at the historically Black library in Gainsborough in Roanoke. And the librarian, I was doing some research, introduced me to Selena Sullivan and said, "You're going to want to write about her one day." I said, "Oh, yeah, why's that?" "Well, she's #1 in her class." So I kept up with Selena, and I was there next to the library, next to the library counter, the day she found out she got into every college she applied to, including she got a full ride at Harvard. And so I followed her story for a number of years. She now runs a library in Christiansburg. But that idea of just showing up for people, finding out what matters to people, and listening to the stories that move me, the things that make the hair rise up on the back of my neck, you know, just as I've gotten older, I've gotten the confidence to follow what moves me more. And so when I picked Silas James to write about in this book, it was the story of him and his band director that I talked about early, that moved me because it showed the importance of community. And I thought, if I can explain how we got to this moment of polarization through this one town, this one kid, then I will be able to help other people explain it too. And it's just, for me, it was just a matter of getting confidence, experience, what Anne Lamott calls ass in chair, like just spending a lot of time writing really bad drafts. And then finding people, finding mentors in my life. My friend Carol here is today. She was my editor at the Roanoke Times for every story I ever wrote that I was really proud of. And she just constantly challenged me to do better, to do better. She would use a red pen and she would write Z's in the margin to indicate boredom. She thought I was getting off track, and it made me better. And other reporters were intimidated by her. They didn't like her suggestions. I am not afraid to ask for help, and that is kind of my advice to you today. Find people in your life that will not only lift you up, but will tell you when you're maybe overriding or gone astray. And I just encourage you to find those people.
Well, I think, when my first book was published, I had barely been out of Eastern Kentucky. I'd been to like Gatlinburg and Cincinnati, And so I think my worldview has greatly broadened because writing has allowed me to see the world and go places I never dreamed I would get to go. But I think that, the more I travel, the more I realize how much people are alike. And again, like the idea that we're much more alike than we are different. And so I think that's become a bigger theme in my work. As far as evolving, every book that I write, every time I write a book, I think maybe I've learned how to write a novel now. This one finally does what I want it to do. But then I'll start writing another one, and I think it again. So in other words, I think you have to continually be learning. It never stops. Yeah. I think when I was in college, I thought, I'll learn how to write a book, and then I'll know how, and that's it. But you keep learning how.
No, and you always are challenging yourself with new, like Lark Ascending was a dystopian novel. Right.
Yeah,
incredible.
I think it's really important to challenge, give yourself a challenge with each book. And, the other thing is I don't agree with all the characters in my books. I don't agree with what they like. In Southernmost, if any of you have read that, some people got so mad at the lead character because of the mistakes he makes. Like, he kidnaps his child, and they would get mad about that. And the thing is, if you don't have any trouble, you don't have a book, for one thing. But the other thing is, you got to let the characters do what they do, because they got to be human beings, and human beings are going to do what they do.
If you're getting mad at your character, you've done your job,
right,
as a writer.
Yeah,
too.
You just want them to have some reaction.
Yeah. And I think it's important for students especially to hear this, that you never, by all accounts, somebody would look at you too and say, oh, you've made it. But you don't feel that way. You never feel like, like you just said, maybe I got it right this time. Mm-hmm. And we always, my students will be stressed out over marks that I make. And I say, somebody marks up my stuff too. Yes. It never stops. You never stop learning as a writer. You never stop exercising those skills.
Everybody needs an editor.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like Beth. I love I have had the same editor for 25 years, which is very unusual today. And what I love about her is she line edits, and a lot of editors don't do that anymore in New York. And I love getting those line edits because she's making every sentence better. So I think one thing you can do for yourself as a writer is to give yourself over to that and listen to other people.
Now, you've both explored these themes of feeling like an outsider in the place that you love so much. And this is one of the questions actually that overlaps with an audience question. How do you think you've been able to navigate a very personal and sometimes complicated retrospective in a place that clearly means a lot to you? Mm-hmm. And you touched on this. But.
Yeah, with Paper Girl, I really had to reach out to experts for help on how to do it. And I go through some of that in that one slide on the things I learned. But with me, I just try to embed, I try to follow the stories that move me, whether it's the ex-boyfriend and how how did our realities get so different? And it's a really complex story. Not everything that he said did I disagree with at all. I mean, he has legitimate reasons for why he doesn't trust the government in some cases. And then just trying to not judge, but just to sit with somebody and understand, like, how did you come to believe that? And so I'm always just trying to understand, not to judge. And in the case of Dopesick, for instance, how did we come to a point where 2/3 of American families have suffered strife because of the opioid crisis? And one of the best things about the show was, sadly, more people watch TV than read books, but a lot of people watch that show. And my 2 goals going in were, A, don't stereotype Appalachia, because I will hear about it at Kroger if you do.
Yeah.
And 2, I wanted a really strong message about medication-assisted treatment, which has been so stigmatized. It's when there's evidence going back 30 years now for it. So, I had to talk the people into that because I didn't have all that much power. But the best thing that was ever said to us after the show came out was somebody called one of the writers in the room and said, after I watched your show, I called my addicted son for the first time in 3 years. And that to me showed that we were starting to flip the narrative about who the real criminals were. It wasn't your cousin that works at Subway and is in jail for selling a user amount of fentanyl. It's Richard Sackler and his ilk, a family of millionaires that wanted to be billionaires. And now we have 2.2 million people addicted. So I find that really gratifying that with our writing, Barbara's book, Demon Copperhead, does such a good job of showing that. I mean, going back to the Stamp Act, right? And you learn these amazing pieces of history from her character, Demon, who is just like the best character, like Holden Caulfield times 10 to me. I love it when you can learn through a one character story.
I think it's good for a writer to be an outsider. And in fact, I think you need to be an outsider, because you need to be outside looking, watching. And I've always had a sort of dual experience. I grew up in such a quintessentially Appalachian family. So I felt very much like an insider of the region. Like I felt like I really understood the culture and that I could point to somebody in my family to represent every facet of it. But at the same time, I was an outsider simply because I was watching and writing it all down. And, you become suspect when you do that. And my first book came out, a lot of family stories are in there. And for the most part, everybody's really proud of that. But every once in a while, somebody doesn't that. Mm-hmm. And they're afraid, they begin to be afraid to talk too much around you or something like that. I think that, like I was saying, the culture has changed so much. It's become so much more divided and vitriolic. And there's a violence where I'm from that didn't exist when I was growing up. That really is a heartache for me. And it's the reason I don't live there. I think, it allows me to write about the place. It would be easy. I think something, like I was saying, it's easy sometimes to either romanticize or vilify. And so I'm just always trying not to do that. I'm always trying to keep myself centered on the fact that most people are good. And I really believe that. And even people I really disagree with, I think a lot of them are trying to be good. And they're doing sometimes things that I see as meanness out of a desire to be good. That's what makes it really difficult. If people were just monsters, there would be no heartache because I could just be like, oh, they're a monster. But right. I can't do that with people I disagree with because they're people I love, and that I know have goodness in them. So being an outsider, I think, can be a good thing. Sometimes it's a hard thing and a lonely thing, but it serves your art.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, place is so important in this conversation. The complexity of place and where we belong and wanting to belong and feeling like maybe you don't belong anymore. Mm-hmm. it's constantly coming up as a theme. Is it possible, and this is another audience question, is it possible to be an artist and not respond to what's happening around you? Why do you think art and literature is important in documenting our shared history?
It's not possible for me. I know some writers who aren't responding, but I can't do that. That's just not. I've always been like that. Mm-hmm. I've always had to call out injustice. It's just part of who I am. I can't help it. I was born that way, and I was raised around people who called out injustice. Yeah. You know, so I do think that it's important, and this I think this is different between nonfiction and fiction. In fiction, I think it's important to not. You don't want to write a polemic. You don't want to beat people over the head. You don't want to go in there with a big agenda. I think the most important thing is you might have a social issue going on in the book, but if you don't have a human story, if you don't have like a family or people who love each other or people who are in conflict or whatever, playing out against that background, it should be in the background and not in the foreground, I think, to be effective. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
You know, I always think about a spinach keys for some reason when I come to that, thinking about you're writing and you're trying to tell the story based on people, but you want to answer questions as they arise in readers' mind. And you don't want to just throw a lump of spinach in there. You want it to be dispersed the way it would be in a quiche, right? With the cheese and all the good stuff, right? So I try to make my books move along with that in mind, answering questions as they arise in readers' mind. And I love to do a historical digression. I get so excited when I find something, whether it's the history of the Underground Railroad in Paper Girl, which totally, you know, is very resonant today, back to Dopesick when I found a clip from 1884 when we had the first wave of morphine addiction, treating the soldiers that came back from the Civil War. And, and then we knew for 100 years, because so many people got addicted with morphine after the Civil War, that we shouldn't overprescribe. But I found this letter to the editor written in the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1884 saying that this scourge will leave no one behind. And if we let it keep going, we will become so divided as to elect a despot. And that was just, I'm always looking for little nuggets in history or even just a moment that, because Dopesick was such a heavy book. I remember there was this moment when I was following a neonatologist doctor through the NICU of the babies that were born dependent on opioids. And she's explaining how they treat them. And we walk in and we're talking. And this nurse who's been trying to get a baby soothed for hours and hours and hours can't be soothed. And she turns to us and says, "If y'all wake that baby up, I will kill you." And so just constantly looking for moments like Barbara does in Demon Copperhead, where there are actually funny things too, or things that bring people to life in ways that make you see them anew. There's this great anecdote about Dr. Van Zee in the early years of OxyContin, and the man still works 16 hours a day, but somebody finds him at a train crossing asleep because he's been working so hard. He just fell asleep while the train was going by. And so stories like that show a new element to somebody, that make you laugh, that are surprising. I'm always looking for the surprise. That's always a really good question when I'm interviewing somebody. What has surprised you the most about, whatever the situation is? I find those to be really telling and elevating of the story.
I grew up in Lee County. I'm from Jonesville, and I was telling Beth that Dr. Van Zee was my great-grandmother's doctor for years.
Still practicing every day, about 16 hours. If you want to see him, you got to go on Saturday.
Yeah. How do you push past the fear of writing about people and places you know, though? How do you... I think maybe you figured it out, but when you're starting out in writing, and in my years with the Appalachian Writing Project and writing with teachers, they're always like, people have to die before I can write about this, what I really want to write about. I can't do it while they're alive. How do you push past that as a writer?
Sometimes I don't. I mean, I have a book that I can't write for a while. But I mean, I think one of the first things I learned as a writer is that you're never going to please everybody. So you might as well give that up, you know? When my first book came out, back then there were book pages in newspapers, you know, in the art section. And the Lexington Herald Leader had a great art section, a great book page. The whole front page of the art section was 2 reviews of Clay's Quilt. One review was saying that, you know, they loved it and it broke all these stereotypes about Appalachian people. The other review was, it's terrible and it perpetuates every stereotype against Appalachian people. So it taught me a really important lesson, you know, that sometimes people are going to bring to the book what they bring to the book.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are going to be changed by the book, you know. So I think most readers come open-minded and open-hearted to a book. But
what about when it's family?
Yeah, when it's family. I mean, I have had families stop talking to me, not so much because of my fiction, but because of my journalism. That's hurtful. You know, like Beth said, I think it's important we got to give grace. We have to give grace to people, but we also have to demand to not be doormats as well.
Yeah.
And so Appalachian people we're not real good in our families about creating boundaries. You know, it's hard for us to put up walls within our families.
But Appalachians are so good at storytelling. Y'all try to go back and interview somebody in Ohio. They are so stoic. Yeah. I'm like, take me back to Virginia. Right. I would rather interview somebody in Virginia because they're more honest and open with their feelings.
Yeah.
In my work, it's really important to be transparent. So I'll explain my process. Most of the people I interview, 80, 90% have never been interviewed before. So I'll say, I'm always going to be honest. I'm going to be open. I'm going to take notes. I'm going to record on my phone. But at the end of this, I'm going to take all the times we've talked, and I'm going to fact check this with you, and I'm going to read you your part for errors of interpretation or fact. Because I make mistakes. I'm human. I misinterpret things all the time. I get with Silas in my new book, I had a few things out of order that he corrected. Yeah. And there were 1 or 2 things that were just too hard for him to have in the book. And I was okay with that. But I just try to say, I'm going to be honest with you. I hope you'll be honest with me. And I did lose one of my dearest friends over the last book. I've known her since kindergarten, since the first day of school. And I was very honest and transparent about the project, and she felt like I threw her under the bus. And that was really, really hard. Yeah. My siblings are still talking to me. I was open with them. I read them their parts before. At some point, we have to be responsible for what we're putting out there and for what we believe. And can
I add one thing?
Yeah.
I think it's really important for me, especially as a fiction writer, and of course for nonfiction, but to never write out of a place of vengeance. Yeah. You know, I mean, that would never cross my mind to do that. And so I think for the most part, that's going to come through to people that you're writing this, you know, to be fair-minded and et cetera. I mean, the only character, I've told this before, the only character I've ever written out of a sense of vengeance is my ex-brother-in-law. I based a character on him, and it's clearly my ex-brother-in-law. And you know, and people say, aren't you afraid he'll sue you? I'm like, he's too stupid to sue me, you know, et cetera. You know, when you treat my sister bad, I'm going to create a bad character and base it on you. But he's dead, so he can't sue me now anyway. But anyway, you know, but that's the only time I've ever done that. Yeah. What I'm trying to illustrate is it's really important for me to tell the truth, but I also never want to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Even people I vehemently disagree with, I don't want to hurt them any more than I want them to hurt me.
Yeah. Sure. Anne Lamott says, if they didn't want to be written about, they should have treated you nicer to begin with. Yeah. She also says, if you have a fictional character that is clearly this person, just give them a small penis, and then they will never admit that was them.
They won't claim it's them, yeah. Yeah, most people are never going to recognize themselves if you portray them in a bad light. They'll only see themselves in the good characters.
Well, that's some writing advice. I was gonna,
Bet you didn't think you signed up for that.
yeah, that was going to be my next question, was writing advice for writers. When I was late teens, 20s, I was assigned to Lee Smith for the first time. And when I discovered Lee Smith, that was everything, because she sounded like me on the page. And I kind of stalked her at book signings until I got to talk to her. And I told her I wanted to be a writer. And she said, "Do you write?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, then you're a writer." And I said, "No, but I need to get better." And she said, "You need to meet Silas House." And you had just published Clay's Quilt. And I figured out that if I waited until everybody else went through the book line, I could have the author all to myself.
Right.
So that's how I met you. So we talked. And she told me to go to Heinemann.
Me
and
too.
I think that's where I really got, and she gave you that advice too, the Appalachian Writers Workshop at Heinemann, Kentucky. And that's where I got to know you. And so my question is, what's the best piece of writing advice that you have for these aspiring writers here today? And how do you discipline yourself as a writer?
I think just doing it, just sitting in the chair, having a deadline, having something you're really passionate about, always be reading. I'm constantly reading. I'm writing my books. I know that's terrible. Always taking notes. I'm always looking to do background research. I'm usually reading a novel at the same time I'm reading 2 or 3 nonfiction books. And then along my career, I've always found mentors at every step. When the edits for Dopesick came back, there were 4 pages of single space. There was 1 good line. 4 pages.
Gosh.
I started to cry.
Yeah.
I didn't sleep. I called my best friend, who is my best friend. We do yoga. She lives in Boston. We do yoga every morning on Zoom. And I said, "Ah!" And she said, "Honey, you don't have time to have a panic attack. I want you to print out a photo of one of the young people who's died of overdose, and right underneath this photo, 157. That's how many people were dying a day of a drug overdose. And that's who you're writing for." And then that night, she stayed up till 3 a.m. answering some of the questions for me on a Google Doc. And so I have different friends that help me with different things. Carol's the smartest person I know. If I'm having trouble just understanding the analysis of an issue, I reach out to Carol. My friend Andrea is an expert on narrative writing. So when my editor comes back with those 4 pages of totally, I can't even understand half of it because it's so upsetting to me, she says, "Well, this is what you did in Factory Man. You start with a really cinematic scene, you kind of seed what's coming, and then you end the beginning with just such a cinematic kicker that even though you're not going to come back to that scene for 200 pages, the reader is going to be wondering about that person the whole time." So at the beginning of Dopesick, I'm visiting a thrice convicted drug dealer in prison in West Virginia. And as I'm driving there, I'm driving through Civil War battlefields where, the morphine epidemic started. So I'm able to tease a little bit of history. And what am I thinking about? I'm worried about this woman that I've gotten to know who's homeless and on the streets and addicted. And where is she right now? She's not returning my text. So I'm able to see that. And then I'm going into the prison to meet Ronnie Jones with the warden and all these locks we have to go behind, and her keys are clicking. I sit down, he sits down, he glares at me. There's the notebook. I'm not allowed to bring a recording device. There's my pen. And we look at each other. And that's the end. I would have never come up with that on my own, but I just accumulated friends, and I help them when they need me. And so, like, what you're doing here, being in a community of writers, is so important. And I just appreciate it. I've been to Heinemann too. I've been to Virginia Center for the Creative Arts a bunch of times. Any kind of training you could go to. I'm always still reading about writing. I love to read about other writers' processes, and I love to get to know them.
Yeah, I would echo all that. Get it on the page, get a community. We have to get past the stereotype that a writer has to be a solitary creature. You have to have a community. I would also, and of course, read all the time. I would also encourage writers to let all the arts feed them. Like when I'm in a writing slump, I go see a film or I listen to music or look at photographs or paintings. I just think all art informs all art.
Right.
Ekphrasis is a great thing.
Yes.
And so that's one thing I teach my students. You've got to learn to be a great observer before you can be a great writer. That's the other thing.
We have one more question from our audience. Someone wants to know your favorite Taylor Swift song.
I don't even know one. I'm sorry.
I have to think. I'm afraid that it's basic, but I think I'd Shake It Off.
Okay, there you go.
I like the message, haters gonna hate and all that.
And she's a writer. She's a very prolific writer. Yeah. As writers go, songwriter.
Yeah, I don't love ever holding up billionaires, but I think she's a really great business person and artist. I think she's done remarkable work, and she's a great philanthropist who does really good things with her money. So I really respect that. Not all billionaires do that.
Yeah. Tyler Childers as well.
Tyler Childers.
Healing Appalachia is an amazing festival, and the way he gives back.
I'm great. I'm cool with rich people who give their money away to good causes,
Yeah. Me too. Beth Macy, Silas House, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I want to thank Mountain Empire Community College and Amy Greer as well. Thank you so much. Want more from the Talkin' Appalachian podcast? Head on over to our Patreon page where you'll get early access to episodes and bonus content, like extended interviews with authors Barbara Kingsolver and Jeanette Walls, my interview with a Southwest Virginia woman who survived a concentration camp before moving to Appalachia, and my 3-part series on the language of Appalachian gravestones. Subscribers will be the first to know about any Talkin' Appalachian merch plus discounts. Subscribe on Patreon and Facebook, and if you're not ready to be a paid subscriber, you can subscribe for free and decide later. You can also find the podcast at Talkin' Appalachian on YouTube.